What's up, guys? Today I'm going to read you a review. I believe this is from 1962. This is a review of Totality and Infinity by one Emmanuel Lévinas. The review is by Quentin Lauer of Fordham University. After having worked in depth several years ago on the philosophical work of both Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, Emmanuel Lévinas seeks, in this, quote, essay on exteriority, to go beyond the thought of the two great phenomenologists. Following other thinkers such as Gabriel Marcel and Martin Buber, whom he in fact cites only very rarely, the author attempts to reestablish metaphysics on an interpersonal basis, thus overflowing both Husserl's rather cognitive phenomenology and, at the same time, Heidegger's anti-metaphysical ontology. Lévinas, nevertheless, does not fail to acknowledge his debt to Husserl and Heidegger. Husserl taught him to root his philosophical and metaphysical thought in subjectivity and experience. Heidegger, for his part, led him to recognize that being could not present itself to thought as an object of knowledge, and that metaphysics consequently is not an objective science. For Lévinas, metaphysics is characterized as the thought of the infinite, a thought that transcends both experience and purely rational totalizing thought. For the infinite overflows the thought that thinks it. Yet the thought of the infinite does not detach itself from experience, which, as a relation with the absolutely other, is realized in the relation with the infinite. Referring to Descartes, the author sees in the idea of the infinite an idea that contains more than one's own capacity. It is the mode of being of the infinite, its infinition. Through the Husserlian notion of horizon, which the author in any case conceives in a completely different way, Lévinas thinks that subjectivity itself is founded on the idea of the infinite. To think the infinite, that is metaphysical transcendence. But how is one to describe this non-objectifying thinking positively? Distinguishing it from objectification, from representation, is not enough. Nor is it to think with Heidegger an impersonal being while setting aside the personal being, l'étant. Rather, one must find the infinite, the transcendent other, autrui, in the relation with the other, a relation that reveals not a totality of which the I and the other are only parts, individuals of a common concept, but a relation of beings as such, remaining outside the distinction between the individual and the general. The task, then, is to describe a certain number of non-objectifying intentionalities that mark the fundamental relation, quote, to someone, end quote, intentionalities that differ from Husserl's representation and from the Heideggerian opening to being. This relation is defined as, quote-unquote, metaphysical, opposing itself to the understanding of being that is called ontological, and ultimately revealing the infinite that surpasses all objectification. First, the author describes the intentionality of desire as relating immediately to an absolute that is not given. It is not a desire of just any sort, but a desire that stands before another, a desire for the invisible, where the other, refusing possession by the I, reveals a surpassing of being. An other, autrui, that hides itself in the other. Here one recognizes that alterity is not a quality by which the other is distinguished from the I. On the contrary, one sees that alterity constitutes the other in his ipseity. Ipse is Latin for self. Ipseity is selfness, or its individuating principle, or the thing that makes it an individual or a self. Ipseity, selfness, is how I think of it. The unique is not the I, as Kierkegaard believes, but the other. And one recognizes oneself as unique only by recognizing the other. Next, the author treats language as the relation of the same and the other. Here there is a relation that we know only by exercising it, a relation not objectified, but which makes possible objectivity, meaning, universality, and representation. Language arises from the interiority of the I, but at the same time opens the I to exteriority, opens it to someone. Language reveals precisely that interiority by virtue of which, quote, being refuses the concept and resists totalization, end quote, page 28. Next, Lévinas speaks of the intentionality of participation, through which the I knows that it draws its being from contact with the other. But this contact reveals itself as a call, not only of the other, but also of the other, autrui. Confusing, because he uses other in different ways, Lévinas, in French. L'autre is the other, literally, L apostrophe A-U-T-R-E, l'autre. And then autrui is simply, there's no L apostrophe, and it's just A-U-T-R-I. He uses it in different ways, and then he uses it with an initial capital, and then no initial capital. To be face to face with another, even the humblest there is to be face to face with the other, autrui, the third, and this direct confrontation reveals itself as justice, according to which one recognizes the other as master, Thereby man proves, quote, refractory to every typology, to every genus, to every classification, end quote, page 46. From this follows the intentionality of discourse, through which man finds himself essentially in an ethical situation. Thus, man enters into the metaphysical experience of the moral conscience, an, quote, experience that is not commensurate with any a priori framework, an experience without concept. End quote, page 74. On the side of sensation, of human corporeality, there is the non-objectifying intentionality of enjoyment, jouissance, which directly opposes the intentionality of representation. It is enjoyment that relates to non-noematic sensible data, to a sensibility that is not of the order of objectifying experience. Finally, one can distinguish consciousness of, that's hyphenated, parentheses, the intentionality Husserl speaks of, parentheses closed, from living from, also hyphenated, parentheses, a quasi-Bergsonian intentionality in which one finds oneself within a non-objectified world, parentheses closed, period. After all, one does not objectify the element in which one is. one bathes in it. Quote, the consciousness of a world is already consciousness through this world. End quote, page 126. This quote-unquote living from becomes concrete in corporeal existence, in a temporality that, instead of hiding the infinite, as in Heidegger's case, reveals it. In sum, Mr. Lévinas's effort aims to reintroduce metaphysics within the framework of phenomenology, a task that is accomplished only if one renounces objectification. To think as a metaphysician is not to think about a world, but to live in a world in which the I and the other constantly resist generalization, recognizing themselves not as the equal parts of a common totality, but as brothers, sons of a common father, a father who manifests himself in the very fact of the personal relation of unique human beings. We have tried here to reproduce a fairly subtle thought in few words and without criticism. However, one must not pass over in silence a great difficulty that comes not from the thought expressed, but from the expression itself. Lévinas has freed himself from Heidegger's ontological thought, but he has not freed himself from the Heideggerian mystique of language. The author ought to have protected himself against the temptation Husserl speaks of in Philosophy as a Rigorous Science, that is, against the temptation to seek depth through confusion. Truisms are truisms, even when expressed in incomprehensible language. Too often in this work, one encounters whole pages whose meaning is very difficult to access. Good pages are almost smothered by words. Philosophy presents itself as a very particular matter in which language has lost its ordinary sense. Finally, like almost every phenomenologist, the author erects into essential intuitions meanings that he had worked out rather subjectively. No need for proofs, no possibility of refuting or rejecting except by another phenomenology, which, by the very fact of being other, could not be admitted either. Quentin Lauer, Fordham University. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Ciao.